My name is Chelsea Stite, and I am the development manager here at OpenMedia. And I just want to say a big thank you and welcome for coming tonight. Both of those things. Give yourselves a little round of applause. Thank you. I would like to start by acknowledging that tonight's event is taking place on the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. Before we get started, we have a couple of announcements. So the first thing is you might notice some of these cameras, and behind them, some lovely community members who are also watching alongside us this evening. So we are live streaming and filming this event tonight. I will also be taking a few photographs of the speakers only. None of you, our lovely audience members, are in any of those frames. You are welcome to take photos, but please no filming. All right? If you need to use the washroom, there is a staircase in the back there that takes you downstairs. If you would prefer an accessible washroom, there's one to the right of the bar, just around the corner here. You're welcome to come in and out as you like or as you need. Masks are recommended, and if you would like one but forgot one this evening, we do have some at the front door available for you. And for food, there is some food on the side here. Please feel free to get up and enjoy throughout the evening. Same with the bar around back behind this beautiful safe. There is also a bar back there for you available for beverages of all kinds. We'll talk with the panel for about an hour to an hour and a half. And if you have any questions, there will be a question and answer period. So please hold on to some of your questions. We will also be taking some questions from the folks on our live stream as well. So if you are watching from home, please feel free to put some questions into the chat. They will be monitored by our social media manager so that we'll have a list of them ready to go. All right? Lastly, we are a grassroots-driven organization, so if you are interested in donating to OpenMedia, there are some QR codes available at the food table and a couple other spaces around the venue. You can also go to our website. There's a nice big orange donate button there. All the funds that are raised from tonight's event will go towards fighting for better privacy in public spaces for all of us. So thank you for all of your hard work there. Once again, we want to thank everyone for attending, for your support of OpenMedia, and for your advocacy. Now I'm going to pass things over to our campaign's director, Matt Hadfield, to introduce tonight's topic.
Thank you, Chelsea. If you're wondering if I'm the Matt from the emails, yes, I am the Matt in all the emails. I'm so thrilled to have you all here tonight. This is a really exciting opportunity for us, and huge thanks to the Internet Archive for making the space available. If you don't know the archive, if you're wondering where your teenage website is, they've got it somewhere, for better or worse, in their folds. Go check it out. So what's OpenMedia? If you don't already know us, we're a grassroots community of about 400,000 people, and we want to make the internet a better place. We want to make it an accessible and affordable place for everyone. We want to make it a safe place for everyone to express themselves. And relevant to tonight, we want to make it a place where everyone's privacy and digital data ownership is respected. That's what brings us here. You may not know it, but this week is Data Privacy Week. So all around the world, people are talking about good digital security practices, good privacy practices, how to keep themselves safe online. And when we were thinking about this night, we were thinking about what can we do in Canada, in Vancouver, to mark this privacy moment. What we didn't want to do is make it all about your individual responsibility. So a lot of the time, people have this sort of personal guilt complex where if your data gets spilled all over the internet, that's your fault. What did you do wrong? How come it ended up like that? And one of our values is we want to see digital privacy protected for everyone systematically and systemically. It shouldn't just be on you. And for tonight's topic, privacy in public spaces, it can't be just on you. We need to collectively get our privacy protected, or we won't have it. So, a lot of companies and governments out there would like to convince you that if you want privacy, or if you want your public safety, you can't have privacy, you need public surveillance. And we kind of have this magical thinking that goes on where people think, well, if a computer does it, it's going to take all the human problems out of it. A computer won't make mistakes. A computer won't show bias. And that's certainly what the brochures that we get from some of these companies say. Now, when we test this technology in the real world, after we see a year, 2 years of it working out, we always find that's not true. And in fact, many of these technologies introduce more bias, higher error rates, replicate and make worse some of the inequalities that we already have in society. And some of our great panelists are going to speak to that. So let's talk about the panel. We got a two-part session. First, our panelists are going to talk about what their work is and how they're fighting for our rights. And then in the second portion, they're going to talk about things you can do to be part of that fight to help defend our online privacy. I'm going to let our moderator, Justin, introduce the panelists. But to introduce Justin, he's a freelance journalist. He's written extensively on privacy, security, and how these intersect with law and policy. And he's done some really groundbreaking reporting in Canada. His reporting revealed that a major cell phone manufacturer was handing over global decryption keys to Canadian law enforcement. He also discovered a secret watch list at the Canadian-US border no one else knew about. And very close to our hearts, he's both an extremely effective user of Canada's access to information system, but also a giant critic of everything that's wrong with it, and is currently doing some advocacy to try to get it fixed and up to the standard of other countries. I hope you're as excited for this as I am, and please feel free to catch up with me or other OpenMedia staffers later in the evening. Please enjoy. Over to you, Justin.
Thank you so much. Appreciate that introduction. Thank you everyone for joining us. It's so wonderful to be back in person, talking about digital privacy. Feels a little ironic. Before I introduce our panel, I want to tell a little story, because I think it's always fun to start these things off with a little story. And it's a story about a program called JLens. It's not going to take very long, I promise. I'll keep this really short. I'm here to moderate, not to speak. But JLens is a program, but more importantly, it's a metaphor. We talk a lot about the U.S. being the world's largest economy, the largest military. The U.S. is also an incredible exporter of metaphors. JLens is a program that is an acronym, like most things in the U.S. military. It stands for the Joint Land Attack Cruise Missile Defense Elevated Netted Sensor System, which is a very complicated way of describing what it actually is, which is a giant blimp. It is an 80-foot-long, 7,000-pound, $175 million blimp that was designed by the U.S. military to loiter over large areas and do what they call persistent surveillance. It's a program that started in the 90s, took off in the 2000s, and ultimately led to two massive blimps floating over Maryland and over Kabul, Afghanistan. And the US military discovered something really interesting. Normally, these giant blimps had very high-resolution cameras targeted, potentially at Maryland, but specifically at the residents of Kabul. What they discovered was that even when the systems weren't working, when the cameras weren't on, when the giant blimps were floating in the sky without doing any kind of actual photography, they discovered it actually had a really useful purpose, at least for the US military. There was one report that said they served as a great deterrent, even if they weren't operational. Insurgents and local nationals alike believe the blimp can see everything and will act differently when it's up. JLens is a wonderful metaphor for runaway surveillance and runaway big data, eye in the sky surveillance, because it also literally ran away. At one point, it became untethered from its mooring in Maryland and traveled some 5 kilometers before crashing into a tree in rural Pennsylvania. The program ultimately was shut down after wasting hundreds of millions of dollars of government money. You have to appreciate the US commitment to wonderful metaphors. So with that as a starting point, I'm going to introduce our panel, because they're really who you want to be listening to tonight. I'm going to start at the far end down here with Bianca Wylie. Bianca is a writer and public technology advocate. She's a partner at Digital Public, and she's the co-founder of Tech Reset Canada. Bianca specializes in government purchasing and the use of technology, focusing on the social and democratic impacts of tech. And then next to her, we have Meghan McDermott. Meghan has worked as a policy lawyer with the BCCLA, the BC Civil Liberties Association, as I'm sure we're all well aware, for almost 6 years. before which she worked in the provincial government, advising on health, natural resources, and climate change. Lately, her work has been focused on police accountability and advocating for public safety models that respect human rights and enhance democracy. Outside of work, she obsesses over plants and animals and has a growing collection, I had to read this a couple times, of pine cones and wasps' nests. Curious about that. We'll ask about that later. Daniella Barretto is Amnesty International's Canada Digital Activism Coordinator, and she's host and producer of Rights Back at You, Amnesty's new podcast. She was an organizer with Black Lives Matter Vancouver when the group discovered they were under police surveillance. So we have some firsthand experience here. She has a background in epidemiology and public health and is concerned with intersections of racism, health, and policing. She co-produced Rude, the podcast, and was runner-up to the 2019 Hot Docs Podcast Festival pitch competition. She's an immigrant from Zimbabwe, and she's now here with us. And finally, right next to me, Trevor Jang is an award-winning writer, digital media strategist, and Indigenous data sovereignty advocate. He's the co-founder and director of communications at Chinookx, a BC-based company building the future of clean energy and data processing in Indigenous communities. Trevor is also co-author of #DataBack, asserting and supporting Indigenous data sovereignty, an ebook that you can pick up at home. Just have to give your email. Little interesting bit of surveillance there. So I want to kick off with it sounds like a pretty simple question. I want to ask you, what is public space right now, right? Public space seems like an easy question, but over the last number of years, the idea of public space has really morphed and expanded. It's no longer just IRL. It's no longer just the physical world. Public space has really widened into something else, and I want to hear your thoughts. Bianca, let's start with you. We'll start at the end of the panel. What is public space in this day and age?
Okay, so I might be conservative with this answer, but I still think it is the in real life interpretation connecting to land and to governance where people have input in how the space is managed. The things that I think some people now consider public space, Twitter, Facebook are two that I hear sometimes, are so deeply private infrastructurally, from undersea cables and satellites to data processing facilities to software. And in that context, we're generally in the consumer lens. That's sort of where our rights sit. So I'm going to stick to the in real life definition of public space.
All right, we have a conservative interpretation of public space here. Yeah. Meghan, talk to me about where you think public space begins and ends.
I might.
You're on. You're good.
All right. I might even be a little bit more conservative, even in that I just want to say that even public space in the physical world, I even looked up public today, and it means like by and for the people. I would argue that even our public spaces in real life aren't truly public because they're really serving the needs of certain social categories, as we know, as we see, kind of anti-homeless initiatives, enforcement, and even just the architecture. There's even, a lot of the architecture in public space was even designed by men, by cis men, so I think there's even a big argument for a lot of lack of inclusion of people even in our in real life public spaces. However, I do really have to agree with Bianca that where we do have some our ability to enforce our rights to our fundamental freedoms and liberties, to be anonymous, and to hang out with the people that we want to, or to be alone, and to express ourselves in these spaces. I think really in the real world, we have a lot more protections for that. The online world is still largely in the hands of private entities. It's very, very easy for your expressions to be shared with others or curtailed, and you aren't left with much recourse. Of course, there's an access to justice problem in the real physical world too, but when you look at the online space, it's really, really difficult. But even just trying to get through to a phone, one of these internet companies is virtually impossible. It's like a one-way communication method. Try to find a phone number for PayPal or Uber. You can't. So, yeah, I'm gonna say it's mostly still just in the in real life physical sphere that we have public.
All right, two very conservative takes. Daniella, where do you think public space really is?
I mean, I think it's a space that isn't monetized, that isn't corporate, the way that Bianca was saying. I think it's space that you can just exist as a human being and not have to exchange money or be under surveillance, exchange data to be there. I think they're shrinking. I think they're small. I think you could argue that they do exist, things like parks, libraries, but again, as Meghan was saying, like, there's so much that goes into making those the specific way that they are. So if they do exist, I think they're quiet, and people are quiet about them because if you're too loud, then a rich white man buys it, I guess. I don't know.
Okay, Trevor, maybe you could be our techno-futurist on the panel. I think you might be. I mean, you do a lot of work with Web 3.0, figuring out what the blockchain looks like for indigenous communities. A decentralized internet could be more of a public space in the sense of, how we're used to talking about it, like in the real world. What do you think the public space really means in this day and age?
For sure. Boy, where do I start? I'm going to start. I'll get to the Web3 blockchain stuff and the digital space part of it, but I want to back it up and start with the in real life aspect of it, because I think it's important just to sort of piggyback on what you were saying around just simply having the right to exist and that being enough on its own. I'll take it another step further and say the right to relate. So if we look at public space in an indigenous worldview, and if I sort of ground my perspective in that indigenous lens on this conversation, I'll use myself as an example. I'm Wet'suwet'en on my mother's side from northwestern British Columbia, and within that, I come from the Laxiliu, or the Small Frog clan. And we as clan members, as nation members, we have our ancestral territories that we have both a right to and a responsibility over. And in sort of the ancestral way of looking at things, we very much see our lands and resources and the animals and whatnot as an extension of us as human beings, and us as an extension of that landscape, or of that space, right? So in a very tangible way of the way that we look at things, we are the space. We are that public space in terms of the in real life way of looking at it. But if I try and bring that to the digital world, obviously that's a bit of a mind bend. How do you take that idea of interconnection, of being one with that space, into the digital realm? And so that's kind of what I'm looking at it, and the kind of the way that we look at it through our company, Chinookx. What we're really focused on is building a distributed network of data centers in indigenous communities on indigenous lands, leveraging indigenous rights and title to the land, where we're putting the actual communication civic infrastructure, and then building Web3 platforms and data sharing protocols on top of that, to create sort of a decentralized, decolonized version of the internet. All right. Roundabout, long way of answering.
No, that's good. That's the techno-futurism I was looking for.
From the past to the future.
But let's start in the very, very physical space, where we're at, maybe looking backwards a little bit. Daniella, I want to ask you a bit about the campaign to push back on a massive CCTV camera operation that was planned here in Vancouver. Here is an idea of a program, and I want you to explain it a little bit about what was being proposed and why you decided to push back against it. But a program that really would have eliminated privacy in the public space. Maybe tell me a little bit about kind of how that came about and how you got involved in it.
Sure. I mean, I'm sure other people might have more of the specifics about it, but yeah, last year, Vancouver City Council, one of the city councillors, Melissa DeGenova, who, context, is also married to a police officer, put forward a motion that Vancouver should basically have the CCTV network installed, and that they would confer with the police about where those cameras should be. And so there was that swift backlash from a lot of community organizations, including Pivot, and Amnesty, OpenMedia, where basically we were rushing to kind of explain to city councillors, other city councillors, like why this was a problem, why this was a threat to human rights and a threat to public space. So, I mean, my response to it was, if you look back historically, the people who are most marginalized are always the people affected the most by surveillance, because it infringes on privacy rights, obviously. It infringes on your rights to freedom of association, freedom of expression, all of these things that you need privacy for. And so there was that, and then there's also this idea that, I mean, I'm probably going to say this a lot and it's going to get annoying, but in the podcast, I talked to a researcher named Chris Gilliard, who basically makes the point that there's been this long-standing campaign by police, by society in general, that more cameras equals more safety, he says. And that doesn't really bear out if you look at research, if you look at evidence. There is not enough evidence to install these cameras across the city and say that this is definitely going to increase public safety, because that's not true. And so it relies on false assumptions that we're just told cameras equal safety, but there's not that much evidence to back that up.
Meghan, let's get down to you, because I think maybe there is a lack of definition about what public space means, right? And it's something like this really forced us to confront, what is a public space? Like, is it a place where we're allowed to hang out, but the government gets to decide the rules of the road? Or is there something more innate about a public space from a rights perspective? You know, maybe talk to me a bit about kind of what that fight really meant for, you know, our civil liberties, for our charter protected rights.
Well, I have to say that while we did have a win last year, and that was great, that we've since had a municipal election with quite a different slate of people, and we've now seen a lot of support and a motion passed around body-worn cameras for police. So, you know, it's the same thing, though. Again, it's just about public space and about what it fundamentally is. I think, Justin, what you said was, is it just kind of like a common space that the government really has the upper hand in? We really see that over and over again, just because of the uneven playing field, really, between the people and the state. There was a time during the COVID pandemic where there was a lot of, concern about people breaking into businesses downtown and just shoplifting, because there were, you know, it was when nobody was in the streets. And at that point, the Vancouver Police Department, for the first time since I've been at BCCLA, they put out a camera just to kind of monitor, like just public monitoring of people, the kind of thing that is so normal now to citizens in UK and other people. And I mean, a resident of the neighborhood came out and actually filed a lawsuit, which is incredible. You don't see that too often, and not many people even know that they can do that, right? And again, it even begs the question, you know, who is this person that would be that informed, that confident, and even has the resources to take these people to task? But that example right there of the police setting it up, and of course they did it in a neighborhood with lower income people, so, you know, again, it's that same, surveillance is magnified on the people who tend to have less power in our society. But that example right there just really shows how easy it is for a state agent to show up in that space and change it in a way that is really going to have a real effect on people's behavior in ways that have been measured, but is also hard to measure. You know, like Daniella was talking about the lack of evidence about whether or not it protects us in public safety, and the lack of evidence there. Well, where we do have evidence is where people think twice about what they do when they're being watched. Some of us are less risk averse than others, and we're more confident. We might do certain things or have certain entitlements and privileges, but I mean, just the fact, you know, that's to me what a big battle of it was about, was persuading the people that we've elected as leaders that this is really going to affect the behavior, if you say yes, of millions of people, visitors to the city, people with all different subjectivities and different experiences. And You know, kind of like if it's not broken, don't fix it. What are you doing? Why would you want to do this? As it is, we're already under so much private surveillance, right? Which I guess is part of the problem, I think, how many people have those Ring cameras and all that, that it might be more normalized, and then we're willing to accept this. But, you know, as soon as the police or the state or sees this, if one of those agencies puts a camera there, you know, all bets are off. It's so different than having just somebody filming you at a bus station, so.
Bianca, I want to go down to you because I think a lot of people still think about, and we're going to stick with the CCTV camera example for a minute, but a lot of people still think of CCTV cameras in a very analog sense, right? I think a lot of people imagine someone pressing a record button on an old VCR and popping a VHS tape out, but more and more, CCTV and persistent surveillance is plugged into a lot of other technology that makes it a lot easier to exploit, a lot easier to analyze, a lot easier to plug into other data sources that it makes it a really, really powerful tool. Can you talk a little bit about what we should be anticipating and what kind of we fail to appreciate about kind of the coming technology that will make this more pernicious?
Yeah, I think the one that we hear the most about now is probably facial recognition technology. And, you know, listening to bring this to the CCTV conversation last year, one thing, there was a lot of emotional pleadings from people who had been assaulted. So it was, which is, when you say emotional, I mean, this was sort of saying, we need to have cameras, like this happened to me. And you had counselors who were looking at someone who was assaulted saying, we want to be able to know who hurt you. And feeling a responsibility, you know, to the person doing that deputation. So it was cycling in and out of some really hard to listen to, you know, violence, and then over to the like, but this isn't actually, preemptively or proactively helping us heal our society to get out of that violence. And so I think where we do see some of the success is so punitive. You know, we are building a society. If you're going down the surveillance road, you're going into the punitive vision of the future. And when I think, to bring this back to facial recognition, one of the cases, and you hear this a lot with technology, this is why I was bringing up the emotional pleading, child safety. You hear about child safety almost every time something's going down in the US. And someone shared with me the other day, I don't know the perfect accuracy of this, but they said, if we can use facial recognition technology for kidnapping, for example, who's going to be against all of that infrastructure, right? From the cameras to the facial recognition technology. Who is going to stand up and say, don't help find kidnapped children? You know, so you're kind of looking for that. What I was told is, I'm going to start with 80 to 90% of kidnapping is happening from family and friends. But if you don't know that, that argument makes sense, right? To a degree. And it's difficult to challenge it because you're getting this thing put at you where it's like, no. For these very rare cases or for this, like this is the reason we should have it. But it's not even responding to the actual shape of the problem. So I think facial recognition technology is a very good, like it's probably the most popularized, you know, what's coming next rationale to plug into the infrastructure of like CCTV cameras. And that's the kind of story you're going to hear from people.
Yeah. Daniella, I want to jump to you for a second because I'm really glad you brought up the emotional component, right? Because we don't talk enough about emotion and feelings as a factor as to why people accept this kind of surveillance, but we really don't talk about the other end, which is the impact on people who are being surveilled, right? Both the psychological and the emotional and the mental impact you have from knowing that you're under the microscope. And I wonder if Daniella, you can talk a little bit about what that does. I mean, as somebody who has been surveilled, has been the target of, you know, the state's prying eyes, you know, what does that do to you? What does that do to your kind of mental well-being?
I mean, I think maybe before I answer that, I want to maybe just add a little bit to what Bianca was saying about facial recognition and that kind of emotional plea. And I think that is a deliberate tactic that police institutions use in order to get the public to further accept extreme invasions of privacy, where people get scared to say, I mean, the response is, well, don't you care about children? And of course you care about children. That's kind of, it morphs the argument into something different that makes people scared to interact with it and scared to engage with it. And I think that's really dangerous because it obviously leads us into this surveillance state that, like you're saying, we already know what these situations look like, and facial recognition probably is not going to help in those situations. So yes, what happens once you realize you're under surveillance? Actually, Justin, I think I've told you this before, briefly in Toronto, that your name was actually next to the uploaded the Freedom of Information request where we actually found this out. But yeah, this was in 2017. So I started organizing with Black Lives Matter in 2016. And in 2017 was when we read those Freedom of Information documents that were in a Vice article about Vancouver's Black Lives Matter being surveilled. And yeah, it was at a vigil outside the art gallery for Philando Castile and Alton Sterling. And in those requests, it was labeled like serious crime, unfolding event, which was really bizarre to read and like obviously has a very racist background to why a Black Lives Matter vigil would be categorized as such. But yeah, I guess what that did to me was it's terrifying to realize that the group that you're organizing with is under surveillance. Well, it's not surprising because Black organizers, that sort of comes with the territory. Like, Black people are together, Indigenous people are together. This is a threat. This is something to be monitored and surveilled. And I think this is where the chilling effect comes in of people feeling, like Meghan was saying, once you realize that you're under surveillance, you're much less likely to want to engage in your basic human rights of association, expression. And yeah, that is what happened to me as I sort of stepped back from that sort of organizing, specifically because it was so uncomfortable and scary and you're not sure. You kind of start questioning everything, and it makes you really uncomfortable to participate in things that, like going to a protest, and then layering things like facial recognition on top. Like, I'm sure we'll get to a part where I can talk about this, but there are extreme stories of how facial recognition has impacted Black organizers specifically.
You know, surveillance doesn't always take the form of a giant blimp floating over your hometown. It can, obviously. But, you know, surveillance goes hand in hand with colonialism. It always has. I mean, it's almost central to the idea of how you come in and colonize a population. You know, and in Canada, Indigenous communities have been subject to that kind of surveillance, both analog and very digital, for, you know, as long as colonization has been here. You know, at what drives, you know, this movement for Indigenous data sovereignty? You know, Trevor, you're so involved in this. Maybe talk to me a bit about kind of where this comes from and kind of what the hope is that you can do here.
Yeah, so I'll preface by saying, you know, I'm not necessarily anti-police or anything like that. My brother-in-law is a cop, and he's a great guy. But you know, and also I believe I'm the only panelist that was not actively involved in that CCTV campaign. So I just want to salute the co-panelists here for your work on behalf of all Vancouverites and anyone visiting our beautiful city. So Indigenous people are some of the earliest advocates for data sovereignty. Just because just speaking for myself personally, I see data as like the final frontier of colonization. Who owns it? Who owns the data? Who controls the data? Who gains value from the data? Is really the colonizer. And so in that sense, we're in this sort of, you know, the fear of the surveillance state, or getting into sort of the hyperscalers of you know, Facebook, Apple, Google in our digital lives, and how our personal data gets exploited for the massive profits of these companies. You know, we are the ones that are colonized here, and so there's always been this innate and deep understanding within Indigenous communities for the importance of having that ownership and control and that access and possession of our data. And it doesn't necessarily get consciously called data sovereignty or Indigenous data sovereignty or the fight for data sovereignty, but there's always been that sort of almost unspoken understanding of our data, Indigenous or non-Indigenous, but like what our data is a representation of who we are. So if we're just walking out there and surveillance cameras are getting, our facial information, like that is a representation of who we are. And at least from an Indigenous rights perspective, like you did not get permission from our chiefs, our traditional governance systems, our band councils to collect that data, first of all. So it doesn't come close to meeting the standards of OCAP, ownership, control, access, and possession of Indigenous data. And I'm sure I'll speak more on OCAP in a little bit. So that's kind of where I look at it, is if, obviously the CCTV campaign was a failure or a success, depending on how you're looking at it. But should that have gone forward, that would have been a gross violation of everybody's privacy rights, but particularly Indigenous people's, because it falls so short of that OCAP standard.
Bianca, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just want to jump in with two quick things. One of them related to sort of Daniella's thing around the escalation, and what Chris Gilliard talks about too, like more cameras, more safety. The first thing is, like, I lived in a condo for a while in Toronto. It was a small condo, and we had cameras. And at some point, someone was either didn't fill up the barbecue tank or there were cigarette butts or something. The speed with which it became, well, we've got cameras outside on an email thread. And I remember being like, what? Like, we're a small group of people who live together. And you're willing to go into, like, let's pull the camera footage on each other for this? So I think culturally, we have to understand how quickly we can, turn on each other when it normalizes and ratchets. And then the second thing, just to expand on the normalization, the work environment is one. Email is a highly surveillant tool. I don't think people get trained people worry now about surveillance with a literal camera watching you work or keystrokes. But I think a lot of people, when they started using email or Slack or whatever, they don't understand that they are creating immense records of their behavior and timed. And even government employees, I used to get emails back and I was like, do they know that I can request this email? Like, have they been trained on what is happening here? So I think these kinds of creeps have already become so ingrained. Because I see people writing stuff down, I'm thinking, why are you writing this down? Why are you writing this down? And I think we're lucky the government is still writing half the stuff down that they write down. So I just want to bring a few mundane examples of this as well, right? Because this is a real cultural phenomenon here, and we're pretty far down the road.
Yeah, and I want to talk a bunch about ownership of data, because I think you brought this up and I think it's so interesting. But Meghan, I just want to go to you for a second, because while we're still talking about this very physical space, it seems to me the government has particularly in BC, has expanded the idea of what public space they get to surveil and what public space they have ownership of. BCCLA has done some great work in figuring out just how far CSIS has gone in surveilling land defenders and folks opposed to pipelines in British Columbia, including on Indigenous territory, going so far as to take a pretty remote piece of land and really ramp up the surveillance operation there, including in partnership sometimes with private companies. Maybe you can just talk a bit about kind of what that represents and your work in highlighting it.
Yes, so there are a number of areas in this province where people, First Nations folks are fighting to make their own decisions over how the lands and waters are used, and then allies show up too. So one of them, for instance, is Fairy Creek on the island. It's attracted a lot of attention. There's a special RCMP unit there. There's one over in the Kootenays, so it's in territories, of course. And the Tiny House Warriors, the Secwepemc Indigenous folks they're trying to stop the Coastal GasLink and the man camps that are being built alongside them. And so I was invited up to Blue River, which is what, well, city people would say it's remote. It's, if you hop on the highway and go towards Edmonton, it's really beautiful. It's maybe like 8 to 10 hours, depending on how fast you drive. And it was really, it kind of felt like I wasn't in Canada anymore, because it was my first experience. It's the kind of thing I see in movies, where there are people in cars. They're all older white men, to be honest. They kind of look like cops, and word is that there's a lot of ex-cops too. And these are private surveillance companies. Well, actually, we don't know who they are. This is what's so weird about it. They're in these black cars, and they're watching people in public, on public roads, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So I was invited up along with another lawyer from another NGO, and here we are, confident middle-class lawyer people going up there. We're like, hey, we're just going to knock on the window and talk to them, right? Because that's what we do if we want to, right? That's what we do in the city here. I just go up to a police officer. I say, what are you doing? As a private security person, I say, what are you doing? Well, that didn't happen this time, and you knock on the window, they just stare at you. They had face masks on too, and they're filming you the whole time too. Not only this though, the 24-hour, 7-day-a-week surveillance of people in black cars, where they won't tell you what's happening, but they also installed a whole bunch of like surveillance infrastructure, like all these towers. Sadly, well, or luckily, drones didn't come by while I was there, but they have drones surveilling around too. Again, on public space, and also what's known as crown, what a lot of us would call crown lands that we tend to think of public space to, is the first time ever I've seen video cameras installed in trees. And under our privacy laws, okay, so I'm like, Coastal GasLink, this is now a public, it's a crown corporation, right? So Canada owns this. So I'm like, okay, if Canada's surveilling tiny house warriors, they got to be following provisions of the Privacy Act. And part of that is to know the purpose for which the information is being collected and who can you contact to find out what records they're collecting, right? They were not doing that. So then come back to Vancouver, right under the Privacy Act, Coastal GasLink. Can you tell me, like, what records you collected? Did you get my voice? Like, what on earth? How much did you collect? All that kind of stuff. We got back like this weird document saying, we can't tell you if we have your info, and even if we did, we don't have to tell you because it has to do with the security of Canada. So this is where, like, legally there ends up being this huge black hole if the government can make the case that it's related to the security of Canada. And this is where we can get into national security laws too, but the way that it's written is even threats to the security of Canada even include when you, oh gosh, I had it right here, but it's where there are threats to governments abroad even, which then, you know, so think about the protests we see in multicultural Canada where people are, you know, expressing themselves about things happening overseas, that this information might be funneled up and shared with those other governments, which, you know, puts a lot of people at risk. So it's just a scary black hole. Security of Canada. So we filed a privacy complaint to try to get at this issue, and it's, you know, you'd never see something like that happen down here in Vancouver. That people are in cars surveilling you 24 hours a day on a street, and they don't respond to you when you're trying to get transparency about it. It's really, really scary, and it really opened my eyes to what people face, you know, especially when it's low visibility. And there's not much media tracking this either, right? Yeah.
Yeah, Daniella, maybe jump off that a bit and talk to me a bit about, you know, we talked a bit about the emotion behind it, but what's kind of the practical impact of being, whether it's an Indigenous community, whether being the Black community, any racialized, marginalized community, bearing the brunt of that surveillance, because, you know, that surveillance can really entrench. I think you've written a lot about this, you've spoken a lot about this, entrench the sort of systemic racism that has you know, continued poor outcomes for some communities.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, there is the emotional impact, like on individuals, but obviously systemically, if people aren't able to kind of push back or claim their rights, that then we just continue along with the status quo. And I think we'd mentioned the body cameras kind of coming in and like the potential for facial recognition to be layered on top of that. I think that sort of vacuuming up data and the ability for policing institutions to look at data almost after the fact and gather evidence that way. I mean, if there's centuries of reasons to be discriminating against certain groups, like that's just going to get amplified. If there's a body camera going 24/7 in interactions with the police, that's actually often advertised to policing institutions as a benefit to body cameras. Is now you have all this extra evidence and when certain communities have high contact with the police, that's exponentially more things that can recriminalize communities and continue with systemic oppression.
Bianca, I want to hear you talk a little bit about Sidewalk Labs. And in particular, there's a quote I grabbed here from you, if I can find it, but I think you basically said, I fear right now is that corporations are beginning to sound a lot like governments, which is maybe a terrifying sentence. Tell me a bit about that. I mean, whether it's body cameras, whether it's facial recognition, it's often private companies that are pioneering this technology. It's often private companies that are coming to be in possession of massive amounts of our data. And it's something like Sidewalk Labs, this project in Toronto that would have seen an entire Google-run neighborhood. They're in some cases hoovering up more data than governments could ever possibly imagine. Talk to me a bit about what that entailed, why it failed, and what might come next.
Yeah, so that quote, I can take it back to when the project launched in 2017. I was sitting in a room, and the CEO of Sidewalk Labs and the CEO of Waterfront Toronto, which is the tripartite, that's the Canadian side, that looked after the real estate on the water. If you would close your eyes and listen, you would be sure it was a government that was speaking, because it was like, we're going to make a new city, a new way of life, like you're listening to all of this, but it's not anyone that me as a resident has any power to influence. This is like straight corporate, right? So you've got like a company talking like a government, and this is right at the beginning, and I remember thinking, because they said, we're going to improve quality of life. And so I think it's a lot that's something that was normal at that point in time. Like it wasn't like when this was launched, people were immediately against it. There was a lot of enthusiasm for this kind of a project. And it's Google, and you had the Prime Minister very excited to be working on a project with Eric Schmidt. Like it was really kind of like it was also the techlash had started. So there was all that enthusiasm, but then also a little bit of like creeping concern. So just a few points to bring it to tonight. Sidewalk Toronto as a project was both real estate and technology and infrastructure. I mean, it was really everything, but it was one of those rare cases where there was significant real estate in play. So this idea of public space, like none of that under that planning would have been theoretically as public as current public space. So that was interesting. But one thing I want to say about that project is I think it's easy for us, it's easy for me to look at the tech companies who say, well, give us a chance to run a city. The really nefarious part is that companies are basically trying to get people to say, the government can't do it, so we're going to do it. And they're making people look to the government and say, look how run down everything is. Look at the waterfront, nothing's developed. And the government is part of that. Because when the government's decided, well, you know what, actually, we're not going to do it, or we can't do it, you do it, that's wild to me. So it's really like the privatization of planning and urban planning and public space that was going on. It was very different than the data collection part. To get to the data collection part, this was also interesting because this is where sometimes the conversations about monopoly and concentration of power are very important, because what Sidewalk Labs copped onto, Google sister company, very quickly was to say, we'll collect the data, but you can have it too. Like, it's just sharesies. Like, we can have it, you can have it, city can have it. Like the government has the compute and the capacity and the machine learning and all this stuff that Google has. And so that asymmetry from a starting point, getting sort of backgrounded, and then just being like, well, we'll all share the data and we'll all do better things together with it. I think in any conversation about surveillance in cities, and this I always look to Ruha Benjamin's work about the datafication of injustice. If you talk to any urban planner in a city, if you think that their first problem is a lack of data, like, you're definitely wrong. We're not even in the top 10. So I also think there was this delusion going on that, like, somehow, oh, the thing we need for a better run city is just a whole bunch of data. Like, that's also absolutely not true. So I guess those are sort of some of the points that popped up for me thinking about this tonight and its relationship as a project. I think it was really interesting that the only word the public really knows to grab onto when we're got concerns with technology is privacy and surveillance. Good privacy and surveillance scholars will talk about power. But privacy, sometimes you're already downstream of the question of, should we be doing this? Because should we be doing this is not the privacy commissioner's problem. And so we get into a lot of mitigation when we don't start with, wait, should we even be doing this? And I think that was partially what was bananas about that project, was to have to watch it go for years where you're like, what? Like, what? You want a tech company to, like, what is going on here? And all the government's in and civil, society's in. And the premise itself was quite wild to me that, and I'll end on this note, this is what concerns me right to this day. Somewhere in Toronto, multiple lawyers signed off on a procurement document that was put out to tender that said, we can have privatized governance of this neighborhood. And that was legal. They put our governance up for sale through data as a construct. And I can't believe that and I'm doing the like taxpayer, which I don't do, but I paid those lawyers. Those are public lawyers. So they're selling off our democratic accountability because we got all these players lining up to do all the things. And I'll, as part of this, just understand the infrastructural investments that these companies have. They are in our classrooms. They're in our public health systems. Like, the smart city is almost sort of like, ooh, bit of a zombie over here. Like, what's going on in our borders? What's going on in our classrooms, right? So I think we need to also understand that the public service delivery is currently heavily dependent on private infrastructure, and that has rights implications. And I don't even think we're talking much about that. So that's, there's a lot there, but I'll stop.
No, I'm glad that you set this up as the way you did, because I think you're right. Privacy advocates like us spend a lot of time playing defense, and maybe it's time we play a little bit of offense, right? So I want to talk about solutions and how we both figure out what privacy hardened technology looks like, what good privacy protections look like, what good charter compliant laws look like, good privacy education looks like. But first I'm going to turn to all of you because I will be disappointed if there's no questions for this very excellent panel. So in a couple of minutes I'm going to turn to you and ask you for questions, and if I don't see any hands up, I'm not going to be happy. I've just finished my first semester teaching in journalism school, and I have perfected the art of staring awkwardly over Zoom until somebody puts their hand up, so keep that in mind. Trevor, I want to turn to you because I think sometimes privacy advocates can be painted a little bit, and I'm being uncharitable here, like the Unabomber, right? Just total Luddites who don't want technology, who are so, tinfoil hat-y, that we just don't want any surveillance of anything ever. We don't ever want anyone to have our data or email address. But that's often not the case. A lot of great privacy advocates are also great technology advocates. Talk to me a bit about how the future could look, a Web 3.0 decentralized internet future that is also centered around data sovereignty and privacy. That's a big question, but I'm giving you a lot of tee up here.
Yeah. So I mean, we can look to, so Europe has some of the strongest data privacy laws in the world through the GDPR. And Canada's privacy laws currently are seen by those in Europe as adequate. It's very European.
Charity.
They are adequate over there, but not as strong as ours, but they are adequate. And yeah, so Canada's privacy laws are pretty good, but not as strong as the GDPR in Europe. The thing about indigenous data sovereignty, the principles of OCAP, which stands for ownership, control, access, and possession. So that was developed in consultation with indigenous communities by the First Nations Information Governance Center, and that's sort of been the established standard for indigenous data sovereignty, that nations have a right to the ownership, the control, the access, and the possession of any data information regarding their people, their lands, language, culture, whatever. So what we see as possible at Chinookx is applying those standards of OCAP for everyone by establishing these distributed network of data centers on reserve, indigenous lands, where we can leverage title and rights to establish that OCAP principle, not just for the host nation, but for anyone who wants to store their data, any individuals, companies, governments that want to host their data on there. So the issue, one of the issues in Europe is that those privacy and data sharing regulations, they were established before the technology. So one of the issues is complying with the GDPR technologically is extremely costly. So one of the benefits of working within indigenous jurisdictions in Canada, we can establish the regulations and the technology simultaneously, right? So you can enhance protections while also lowering costs. So that's kind of our main focus. And then you can build the Web3 data sharing protocols and platforms on top of that. You know, the topic, tonight is public space, and like the internet, as it currently operates in this Web 2.0 world, it's not public. All these social media platforms that we use every day, it's not public, but it could be, and it should be. And the technology exists for it to be. So I think that's a good place to start, is just looking at how, and that's true economic reconciliation too, is empowering indigenous nations for the betterment of everybody.
Because it's fair to say that where we are right now, data is power and it's capital, right? There's a reason why Google wants to hoover up a massive amount of our data about what we do with our day-to-day lives, because they can commercialize it. But if you let people control their own data, they can choose to commercialize it, they can choose to keep it private, they can choose to use it, they can choose not to. But maybe more importantly, no one has that leverage over them.
Well, as it currently stands, every single click, every single like, every single follow message, everything is getting bundled up and sold to advertisers for massive profits, with none of the value coming to us as individuals, even though it's our digital activity and our psychological profiles and our makeup as people interacting on this technology that is creating that value in the first place, right? So I really believe that one day in the future, we're going to look back on this sort of, Facebook era as pretty primitive in our digital evolution as a species. And, maybe my grandkid one day be like, "Grandpa, you really used to let corporations take value out of your personal data? How come?" "Well, son, we were just foolish back then, and we didn't know any better. We were just happy to be off dial-up,
Every day.
But really, it is primitive when you look at what these distributed platforms are capable of. Absolutely. And we can one day have that power to choose. If I want my personal data and social media activity to be shown to advertisers, or to go into this survey, or to be used for health research over here, or psychedelic research, but pharmaceutical research. Pharmaceutical research, sure, you'll make more money, but you can make that ethical decision, right? And the technology is possible, and indigenous data sovereignty principles are a good regulatory framework to get us started.
Yeah. Daniella, talk to me a bit about figuring out this piece from a rights perspective, from the grassroots perspective, from an education perspective, right? You do a lot of this outreach, whether it's through BLM, whether it's through your podcast. How do you marry the principles of social justice and also privacy? How do you get people invested in this idea of owning their own data, of being in a privacy hardened? What does that look like?
That's a hard question. I guess, again, other people feel free to jump in. But
you're not getting off the hook. I want to hear it from you.
But I think maybe showing people how it can personally impact them. I think a lot of times we speak about privacy, we speak about surveillance, and for a lot of people it's very abstract, and it's hard to understand like how this concept could actually impact you personally as someone walking through the world. And so at least what we're trying to do with the Amnesty podcast about surveillance and systemic racism is to kind of show stories and talk to people who have experienced like the personal impacts of surveillance and violations of their rights to privacy, because I think that helps contextualize it for people. It helps make it more concrete.
Yeah, and I mean, being under surveillance can make you feel really helpless, right? I mean, this is the idea of the panopticon. When you know that, the tower in the middle has its eyes on you, it makes you feel very small. But giving someone the power of advocating for their privacy is a way of making someone feel like they have a stake in this society, and they have a bit of power that they might not otherwise have. Good, you agree. Meghan, let me turn to you. What does it look like? What's the next step here for how to better enshrine our privacy rights? Privacy Act may be adequate, but it's also increasingly outdated. What does the next step look like here? And given that it doesn't seem like there's a lot of appetite from governments to legislate this in a big way, what does a legal remedy look like here?
I have to totally agree with Trevor. I think that what the future should look like is that we have control over our personal information and what we generate in our digital footprint. I don't see any reason that the systems can't be built that way. And it's really sad as an advocate, but just even as a person, to look at, there is a bill right now before Parliament to revise privacy laws in Canada. It's just so clear when you're reading it that corporate stakeholders have too much influence. Like it continues to be skewed in favor of the business community, which is just bizarre and strange, and it's just frustrating because we have these abilities to proactively entrench our rights, and it's ridiculous to have civil society groups like ours trying to catch up after the fact and try to get a court to interpret one of our very few rules in a really principled manner. So I don't know. At the beginning you were talking a bit about my background as like in natural resource environmental law, and I think a lot of our problems a lot of them can be solved if we look back to the Indigenous communities on whose lands we are and talk to them about their values and their legal orders. And I'd be very interested even just the approach that Trevor and his company is taking and the relational aspects of all of this. And I think we just gotta, stop. Yeah, and when I was in government too, I never worked for Government of Canada, but just how easily government will defer to the business community. So if we have any privacy proponents here who are in the private sector, I'm always saying to go, they listen to business improvement associations before they listen to us, right? Like that's why they were doing the video, the CCTV thing. Businesses want this. They want to penalize people who ruin property. So, anyhow.
What it sounds like is what we need is a privacy lobby, right? Which just doesn't exist right now. There's really no incentive for it. But Bianca, you made an interesting point when we were chatting earlier, which is that you've found a strange and unlikely common cause with, of all people, the folks who are coming out for the Freedom Convoy, right? Folks who are deeply distrustful of the ArriveCan app and some of the ways in which governments have wildly expanded their data collection processes in this name of public health. Processes that are maybe okay, but never really had a good debate, never had a good airing, never really had a good kick of the tires in terms of making sure our privacy rights are absolutely respected across the board. Does coalition building work on privacy work? Is there a way in which you can kind of tap the paranoid types, the civil libertarians, the progressives, the grassroots activists? Is there a way to build a privacy coalition there?
It's a good question. The issue, I think, with organizing around privacy generally, one of them at least that I've experienced, is people feel like it's inevitable. Like where we are today is so, like the cat is so far out of the bag, I'm not sure if that's the thing you say, horse out of the barn, right? And the idea when we talk about, I really keep coming back to the corporate element of this, and I think we've touched on this multiple times, but here's a different angle for me that I would love help with from everyone as to how we bring this into some of the privacy discourse, which is the majority of the technologies that we now take, I'd say for granted, so to speak, a lot of them rely on increasing efficiencies in our transactions and our relationships, whether it's in labor context, whether it's public health delivery, like telehealth, like all these times where you use technology to get something faster. When you spoke and said, sometimes we're painted as Luddites or whatever else, for me, in this political moment we're in, and I don't want to, I want to acknowledge we're in a pandemic. We're watching institutions break faster than, you talk about Convoy and, what's going on in Canada. The reality is, to me, the only way out of our political moment is to build stronger relationships with each other, which is highly inefficient. It's actually asking us to engage with each other in ways that our technologies do not encourage us to do. And I do think when we talk about your own data collection or whatever else, I think a ton, this is the product manager history for me, a ton of what's collected doesn't ever have to be stored, because the reality is all the infrastructure, the GPU, the compute, everything to manage all of these technologies that we take for granted, it is all private. And you're not going to see the state sink billions of dollars into matching for any kind of public version of it. That's not going to happen. And so I think that's why the CCTV conversation in Vancouver was so fascinating. It was basically look, man, are we going to start to go the other way here? Or are we just going to complete this circuit and close it? That's to me, we can't organize around something as niche as technology or privacy, because it's too small. We're in so much trouble right now in our politics, and I think that these things are just accelerants. A lot of the technology stuff is an accelerant of something that needs to be remedied, but it was there before, you see it popping up as a symptom. So to end in a tangible way, Arrive Can, COVID alert, all these things that, David Murakami Wood is a surveillance scholar. He talks about the 5 eyes, of which Canada is one. Canada ain't in charge of the 5 eyes, it's the US. There's been a long infrastructural plan here, not in any conspiratorial way generally, it's all laid out. The state's not your friend with this, and the companies aren't your friend with this. And to me, we're now at this point where you don't need anyone's specific data anymore. You've got synthetic data, you've got patterns, we don't have any collective privacy. If you opt out, you can't opt out of the harm. You can opt out, but you're still gonna be harmed. So I think we have to really understand we're in a bad place, and it's very expensive to maintain the majority of the technologies that we use. And our governments aren't doing that, it's the private sector. So those are just pieces that I can't ignore, and to me, we have to organize around, do we wanna be getting into I don't know, I think about capitalism is imploding, so we have to go from ownership to stewardship. How do we share what we have? What do we do about it? If we can't own all these private infrastructures, we gotta be in charge of them, right? This is to me, it's all governance. So when I try to write the word governance in something, that's not a popular word. But this is, to me, we have to roll this up a bit into how are we talking about the political moment we're in? Because I think when people hear privacy, they're like, oh, I'm not a technical person. That's not mine. And I'll end on what you raised earlier, redress, access to justice. All these laws, they write them because they know no one's coming to actually call them on them. And if they are, it's that random, I have time or knowledge enough to file a lawsuit. Your rights are only as good as your access to them. It's so broken there. And they know that. The federal government knows that. And they traded off our human rights into, Colin Bennett is here tonight, Valerie Steeves. I mean, this is when PIPEDA was written, we decided we were gonna commercialize human rights. We did that 20 plus years ago. And now we're building AI law on top of it. It's like a house of cards, right? So I'm not exactly sure where the insertion point is, but I think it has to be upstream of privacy. And actually, this is my last point to come to arrive, Can. The Privacy Commissioners of Canada said to the federal government, in a pandemic, do not make any technology mandatory. The federal government made ArriveCan mandatory. So when they can ignore the Privacy Commissioner because it's a public health crisis, but they don't even have to say what it did for the pandemic, we are also missing some kind of an ombuds person here in this structure because it's too far downstream. So.
Good point. Okay, I know we have questions here because I've put the test to you already. I've already asked you to sit there and think of your very, very best questions for this very, very excellent panel. So do we have any? I see one in the back already. We can take a break first, absolutely. Yes, we can. Of course we can take a break. So sit there and stew on your questions so they'll get extra good. focused. We're taking about maybe 10, 15 minutes, and we're going to get some closing thoughts. I have one last question for the panel, but any questions here? I know you're all teeming. Let's start right here. We have a microphone going around. Just wait for this to show up.
Okay.
Oh, you jumped in queue. You'll go next.
Trevor mentioned GDPR is a good example of how privacy is being done right. But then you have the other side of the EU wants to siphon up all the financial transactions, particularly around cryptocurrency and so on. And once you get all those financial transactions, it tells you a lot about what people do, how they live, and so on. Is there any hope for us? Is the question.
Maybe.
Or what do you think is the next step for us as a general rule?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've harped on this point for a few times tonight, but I do think, and this piggybacks on what you were saying earlier about governance and how this conversation really starts much before we actually get to the privacy and the security question. It starts much earlier, and I think generally speaking, we're talking about large-scale systems change, and to accomplish large-scale systems change, we need leverage points for implementation. And I think that indigenous title and rights are just an incredible leverage point in terms of decentralizing and decolonizing these systems. So I think we have a good framework through OCAP, ownership, control, access, and possession. And then how that sort of plays out on the ground with the technology is yet to be seen. But I think that we're starting at a place that just has a much higher standard for personal autonomy than anywhere else in the world that I know of by applying through OCAP.
Yeah, and I have one particularly Canadian thing about the GDPR, which is I like that in Canada we have one piece of legislation for the Privacy Act for the federal government, and it trickles down for the use within the public sector, and one PIPEDA for the commercial use. And the thing I don't like about the GDPR is, to me, it's this blender of data is just data. And I think this is this point in time. We need to be real clear about our rights and accountabilities for public service provision versus our rights, responsibilities in relationship to a consumer context. So I get nervous because the way I see the feds kind of talking now is they want that blender, like that sort of GDPR situation. I don't know if that's going to happen. But I'll end by saying machine learning, artificial intelligence, all the things that the data is getting fed into, it is at absolute odds with if we believe in our legal system, context is everything. Specificity, when did the thing happen? Contextual integrity, who is it specifically? What time of day? Machine learning, artificial intelligence, it's patterning into the future. It's just repeating the past into the future. It's not at all coherent with our base. I don't like the GDPR. I'm not a fan.
Now that I'm not asking the questions, I get to give some answers. But I think there's a lot of people who put faith in things like blockchain as the solution for privacy, right? This idea that technology will be the sort of hole we can hide in and hide away from the prying eyes of government, but it rarely works that way. It's actually an interesting line, a word that I don't think I've ever really seen before, techno-solutionism. It's actually in this open letter that I think you signed, maybe multiple of you signed about the CCTV camera campaign here in Vancouver. There's this idea that technology will just solve everything. We have a problem right now, but don't worry, there's a technology on the horizon that'll fix everything. It's also going to fix climate change and racism and everything else in between, right? But it never works out that way. We need to figure out how to fix laws, fix regulation, fix policy, and discourse, because that's ultimately going to be the framework on which all of these technologies come in and how they're going to be privacy hardened and protected. Yeah. So, you're next. You were first, but you're next now.
Panelists, thank you very much. Justin, OpenMedia, also, thank you very much. Meghan, I'd like to, if I may, send one your way. With the redefinitions under the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2015, allowing police to be actioned on may instead of will, combined with the redefinition of terrorism being the simple interference with any economic activity which Canada believes is in its own interests. Is that where systems like the people sitting in black cars and the video cameras on trees can't be challenged? Or where else is the legal justification or basis for that coming from?
Do you mean the legal basis for that activity?
Or blocking the ability to challenge that, and or having a big black box that you can't then look at the data within?
All right, so what my reading of the laws, and I think a lot of other folks too, and it hasn't been challenged much since it's come into effect, the new C-59, but my reading of it is that it really creates a whole bunch of dead ends for the average person. There's something called the Security of Canada Information Disclosure Act, and what that does is it allows the sharing of information between different departments with a really kind of low threshold. Like, it just, you know, if it has to do with the security of Canada, and you're asked for it, then that ministry or whatever, Crown Corporation, can hand it over, and it can go all over the place, right? So it could go from RCMP to Canadian Border Services, or it could go from Health Canada to CSIS, or it could just go anywhere. And then, of course, and something we've been pushing for too is transparency with information sharing agreements with other governments as well, right? So even knowing how governments internal to Canada share their information with one another, but then also how all those public entities can also ship stuff abroad. And we also know that countries, because there are higher standards in some countries at least, in Canada and US, this is the case for citizens of it, we have more protections in terms of our privacy, although not strong enough, that it's easy to then, the Five Eyes, the countries can just ask each other to spy on the citizens and easily cut corners that way. So I mean, it's a really frustrating collection of laws that if you look on all of them on their face, they make sense, maybe. But once you kind of string them all together and actually start poking at them a bit, and because I was actually happy. I was like, oh, thank God Justin Trudeau and his government bought this pipeline, because now I can actually get some accountability out of this. Well, that's a naive thought. Like, you can't. It's a dead end. And now, of course, we're having to do a privacy complaint, but those take a long time. I don't have there's not much confidence in that system after the fact too, so it's bad.
I'm going to give you one comment on that, but any other questions? One right back here, but just really briefly, we talk a lot about, and rightfully so, the Anti-Terrorism Act, C-59, C-51, but a massive amount of government surveillance is still operating under provisions from the criminal code that were written in the mid-20th century. General warrants are used constantly for surveillance campaigns, for intercepts, for surveillance details, and those are provisions that were written, in 1950. Something odd. So updates are always worth paying attention to, but we also have to look at the old stuff in that act and fix the thing top to bottom.
Hi, good day. Thank you so much for coming tonight. My question is about data protection in British Columbia and how much may be lost with the passage of Bill 22 in Victoria in the fall of 2021 by the Horgan government. The BC Privacy Commissioner, Michael McAvoy, wrote into protest. He said some good things. They go some way to strengthen privacy protections, making new requirements for privacy management programs, mandatory breach notifications, so-called snooping offenses, and privacy impact assessments. Those are good. But on the negative side, said what is exceedingly troubling, however, is that government now proposes to allow public bodies to send British Columbians personal info outside Canada without explaining how they were properly protected. They're asking the Legislative Assembly to give them a blank check to eliminate the current restrictions on public bodies sharing the data outside of Canada. And that was pushed for, of course, by marketing companies who are very happy with that. So wondering what you all think of how bad that is, whether the chance of reversing it. And question for Meghan, now that David Eby is now premier, the former leader, president of the BCCLA, who worked on these issues, privacy issues and so forth, is there any hope for progress there?
Is there any hope for progress?
Finally, I've been asked this question in public. If this is public. And I have some members of my team here. All right. Okay, the data sovereignty and, keeping stuff in BC, I think that I'm not hopeful that we could bring that back. I'm sorry, I'm just cynical, but maybe with having David Eby, it's been interesting to watch his leadership campaign and everything. We were very horrified to see him dangling the notion of coercive treatment for drug users in BC. We were like, whoa, how could anybody who worked with us be offering that kind of solution to whatever's happening right now? But he's walked that one back. So I don't know. I'm looking at this fellow as a political creature and what is going to help him stay in power, I suppose. And that's just my personal opinion and not that of my organization. Yeah. So I don't know. We'll kind of wait and see. I was, though, grateful to see that he walked back the coercive treatment thing, because my gosh, I mean, it's just horrifying, and maybe is just an opportunist. I don't know him in a personal capacity, but yeah, politician at this point. But of course, given what we saw from him as an attorney general, well, it'll be interesting to see what we can expect from him. Yeah, I guess I'll leave it there.
We're very, very nearly out of time. We throw in a question, and I will wrap it in. We have one in the back, right? No more questions.
Oh, I have a question.
Okay, go on. And I'm going to wrap this in. I'm going to give you all kind of a final word, and we're going to wrap this question in as we
So
wrap up.
I do work for OpenMedia, but this is my personal question. My question is about mobilization and education, because I love what you're saying about working upstream. Okay. And my feeling, at least at this organization, is that the way we work upstream is we mobilize people. I am a parent of 2 young children. I have a 6-year-old and a 2-year-old, so I'm always in the communities of, but think of the children, as you mentioned before. And there's this thing I think about all the time that happened on Halloween in my community, where we were going trick-or-treating with our kids, and afterwards someone posted on a parent Facebook group that there was a person who was in a house who was filming kids as they came to get candy and encouraging them to wave at the camera and be cute. And they were talking about how upsetting this was, that their child had been filmed. And then many people brought up, well, your child was actually filmed at dozens of houses by the Amazon Ring cameras. And so if you're going to go ask that person to delete the footage of your child, you better go to every door. And the response from many people was that it just felt different. And it's so interesting to me, because the much more nefarious thing in my mind is the Amazon Ring camera, rather than a person who probably wanted a cute video of kids at their door. But something about that felt wrong to them. So they could feel the wrongness of that surveillance, but did not connect it with the wrongness of the surveillance of doorbell cameras. And I wonder how, whether it's Save the Children or whatever kind of narrative, how we work on moving that emotional piece, as you talked about earlier. Like, there's emotion in that, in protecting your children from surveillance, protecting your community from surveillance, but people don't seem to see it in those nefarious ways. And I guess I'm just wondering if you have any ways that you have communicated that or worked to flip the narrative of emotion when it comes to protection from surveillance.
Okay, I like that question. But I'm going to go down and ask each one of you to respond to that. How do you deal with that appeal? How do you deal with that education piece? How do you deal with calling people to action? But I also want to ask you, and this is a bit more of a pessimistic question, what is one piece of technology or a strategy or a tactic or a trend that is making you very nervous going forward? So we're going to have a bit of optimism, a bit of pessimism, and then we're going to call it a night. So Trevor, let's start with you. Piece of technology that makes you nervous, but also a strategy on how to get people caring about their privacy and engaged on these issues.
I think that, so I guess just sort of sum up my own personal journey. I'll try and answer both those questions and sort of summarize my own personal journey to this point. I started out as a journalist, and then mainly reporting on Indigenous rights issues, and then became way too disillusioned and bitter at too young of an age, so got out of that. And then I, for some strange reason, thought that maybe I would go try and be a capitalist for a while. And I actually studied digital marketing, and I studied sales writing for direct response marketing and things like that. And then obviously that was not for me either. And then that sort of, but all of that led me to sort of where I'm at now. And I think a lot of it has to do with, again, tying into the concrete examples and the sort of the stories that we tell around that, and the biases that we create around that. You know, we started the night talking about the CCTV cameras and a lot of the sort of the, you know, violence, fear around, you know, downtown East Side and things of that nature. I think it's so hard to separate like the way we think about technology and the social issues that it's attempting to address. Like if we, you know, we're in the middle of an overdose epidemic, magnified by isolation from a pandemic. And so of course we're gonna have an increase in mental health distress and all of the different social ills that come with that. That doesn't mean we just need to shove more police resources to put that problem away, right? But the story of protecting our children comes up as a way as a justification, right? So I'm kind of rambling here, but I think it's the story that we tell ourselves, I think has a lot to do with it. And then as far as educating, it's just, you know, it's opportunities like this, just to gather and come together and share just four very different points of views around the same issue. I think that's important. And as far as what technology scares me, having done the journalism, having done the digital marketing, and now being in this sort of Indigenous data sovereignty world, it's the advertising algorithms. Because I've seen it from 3 different points of view now, where these, as a journalist, like you're going up against the social algorithms where you're trying to promote your stories, which is rigorously researched, rigorously fact-checked. So much journalistic integrity goes into producing, like, even an 800-word story has to go, all the work and the ethical focus that goes into producing a piece of journalism. You're then throwing that to the wind, the digital wind, with everything, and you're fighting for eyeballs, right? But these social platforms and the advertising algorithms, they don't reward truth, they reward engagement. So they reward things that cause a lot of response and cause a lot of comments and engagement. It doesn't care if it's positive, negative, true, false, that doesn't matter. So I've seen it from that angle, and then I've seen, you know, what we have to do to sort of reach audiences on these platforms. You have to play the game. You have to use the algorithm for the sake of your own brand and for your own, even journalism companies have to spend money on advertising to boost their stories up the algorithm, right? So we're really coerced into basically playing the game of the tech oligarchs. And it's that advertising algorithm. And that's why I really believe that it comes down to raising the bar of data sovereignty and building the platforms on infrastructure that is not centralized and distributed with distributed platforms and data sharing protocols on top of that. So that's my fear, and I've seen it from inside and outside. And you know, there's a couple different people in the audience have asked in various ways, is there still hope, or is all hope lost? And to be perfectly honest with you, my answer to both those questions is maybe.
I will try to answer in the same order, I guess. Yeah, I think that's a really important question. It's like people respond to emotion. I think seeing a person holding a camera does feel very different from this I don't know, like a doorbell camera. And I think that emotion is so important, and in people understanding the threat of these kinds of technologies. And I mean, to talk about the podcast again, that's what we're trying to do in this podcast with Amnesty, is kind of engage people in stories and emotional understandings of the threat of surveillance. And Justin, you know this very well, like your podcast, The Village, is amazing. Just how engaged people can be with that medium. And so, I don't know, we'll try something new, we'll see. The third episode is actually about Ring doorbell cameras, so I think you might enjoy that. And then the threat that I didn't actually know how to answer this question. I was looking around online a couple of days ago, and the Yellowhead Institute, an Indigenous research group based out of Toronto Metropolitan University now, somebody from there published something called Domestic Drones. Her name is Aziza Kanji, and this was just a couple of days ago that she published it, but it was really interesting and scary because Canada is purchasing a bunch of armed drones, and there's so little information about it, and a lot of the scenarios are scenarios that would impact marginalized populations, particularly people engaging in protest. And that is just a scary, scary concept of drones flying around, potentially armed.
I'm actually glad you brought that. That was my story. I wrote the story about the armed drones request for proposals, and one of the proposed scenarios in which it would be useful is very akin to that big old blimp. They envisioned flying it over a G20 protest and doing persistent mass surveillance of people's faces and potentially plugging into facial recognition. So, yeah. Meghan, let's get down to you.
Okay, so as for the, how do you challenge people's emotional attraction towards wanting cameras and surveillance, I think it's maybe just, you know, asking for the evidence and the data kind of thing, like just kind of get people to check themselves a bit. So we see the whole way of framing it as protection of children. We see that over and over again in so many aspects of justifications for surveillance. We've had a big campaign at BCCLA to end the practice of street checks, which is when police just stop people on the street and ask for their ID, record who they're hanging out with, all that kind of stuff. And every time, and we see it over and over again, police agency, their impulses, they always turn it back to the pedophile at the child playground. And then you ask them a little bit of it, like, okay, like, has that happened? Because for the most part, if somebody was a risk to children, they have conditions of their release that they're not allowed near those playgrounds, and you are allowed to ask them, right? So it tends to be, you just kind of need the facts and the evidence and really use your critical thinking skills while being mindful. And again, I love this, using the emotional stories to create a consensus around how important privacy is for us still, right? And how inherent it is to our humanity and our communities. As for, you know, spooky stuff, there's so many different spooky things on the horizon. Well, one thing definitely, we've talked about it already, and it's just a trend that we're seeing more and more, is just kind of the tangled surveillance, where it is the private and the public. And it allows the government to hide behind the private entity, and because our privacy laws aren't as strong with private entities, and they've got deeper pockets than government. The other thing, though, and it's something that we haven't worked much on at my organization, but it's so interesting, is like DNA, sharing of DNA, and how publicly accessible this is, and how popular it is for people to find out about themselves and their family. And I think we're still just at the beginning of how much health information that actually discloses, you know? So when you're talking to your grandkids in the future, I think this will be part of that primitive way of using the internet, that we're actually giving this away for, like, and we're paying them. We're paying them to give this information away, so it's wild.
All right, Bianca?
Yeah, so I really like the way you asked this question in terms of the difference between the person holding the camera and the system, because it's the person and it's the agency, and you have an actor that you as a human can look in the face and say, are you doing this? And you can also get them to stop. And you can also get them to question themselves. And I think that, I'm going to answer on the risk side first. To land what I was trying to say earlier about efficiency, ArriveCan, anything that has like a digital identity component and that's mandatory, for me, is the nightmare world. Because what I hope we could do in Canada, and I'd love to legally enact this somehow, is have mandatory redundancy. If there's a digital way to do a thing, there's also a person that you can do it with. And we have that in some of our public services. But to go back to the person part of this, the CBSA is the second largest police force in Canada, which I learned understanding ArriveCan. Whatever your feelings are for the police, these are still unionized workers. These are people, and there's agency there for their decision making. When that role is an infrastructure that has no agency anymore, and you're just working the buttons, I mean, this hits the worker, this hits the traveler, this hits the resident, this hits the refugee. You're never the one who's trusted if the system's not working. So for me, ripping the human beings out of all of these infrastructures is so dangerous. And when you have these mandatory technologies, and digital identity, I think, is one that we've tangled with before in Ontario, got shut down, but you can feel this ArriveCan was a little bit of a testing ground for how would the public react, and a lot of people like ArriveCan. And this is what I mean, the trade-off. You say, I can go through the line a bit faster because I don't have, that's all about my rights to go through border services faster. The flip side of rights is responsibilities. And in order to manage any digital infrastructure, we have to get into our collective responsibilities to each other to say, maybe I don't go as fast because I'm opening or leaving some more room for how these public services get delivered. But I don't think, from what I saw with ArriveCan, that that's where people are at. People are very happy to take the convenience, but they should know they are impacting the other people that use that system, right? And this convenience thing games us against each other. And I find that really troubling. So the digital identity is the thing I don't like. The tactic that I found effective was, instead of going to governments, and I am so not in the mood for the governments, right? Like, I'm not raw institutions at the moment, but it worked to flip it, or instead of saying what they should do or how the law should be written, you bring the harm and you say to them, what are you doing about this? Because this is happening right now and you are accountable for it. And I think we need to flip and ask more questions of our representatives rather than thinking they don't know what to do, because they have to figure out how they're resolving some of these harms. So I think we actually have to talk more about the real harms, and often they're just exacerbated by technology. We know the harms. We know the harms of our, different systems. I think, police have guns. We haven't got that use under control of that technology. So we have to really keep going back to first principles on accountability and violence. But I think we have to, for me, asking those questions is helpful, and accountability and access to justice and redress, and what do you do when something goes wrong, and how do you make sure people can get what they need from systems, is a different tactic than campaigning with this is what you should do. Because I'll end on this note, a lot of people with technology do not feel comfortable asserting a thing to do, but they feel pretty good about asking questions because they're also uneasy. The bank teller I talked to at the bank, they don't like that they have surveillance cameras in their branch. You know how many people are under this kind of casual surveillance? And that's there. I live in Parkdale in Toronto. They've got a lot of cameras because there's people outside the bank. But the workers are also impacted. There's a whole chain here. So I think we have to tap into these different ways that people engage with the technology and are surveilled. And some of them are kind of mundane, but they bother people. But they don't feel confident to get into these fights. So they're like, I'm not a technical person. So I think that, for me, it's kind of flipping it around and showing that you cannot know the answer, but you can damn well say this is a problem. And it's on your, this is your problem, not mine, right? And this private-public stuff, big time. So.
Okay, that about does it for us tonight. Thank you so much. This panel was fantastic, the perfect measure between optimism and pessimism. So please give it up for our fantastic panelists. Thanks so much to OpenMedia for putting this on, and everyone have a wonderful evening.
Thank you, Justin.